And let's move on. The last one, last question. And one of the options was a differentiation of the Royal College's role.
Hello. We actually felt there were more than one question and also more than one union, although we seem to be referring to just one today. We certainly did feel that we need to do something and to do something relatively quickly. We felt that there's quite a lot of difficult stories in the press at the moment, and we recognise that there are times the public are very anxious about some of those stories and the way that health and nursing, in fact, is portrayed. And we did think more needs to be done to promote positive stories. We did recognise, though, that by becoming more transparent with more measures and having those more readily available in the public, that inevitably there was going to be some negative stories as well as positive stories as a result of that. And to a certain extent, we needed to brace ourselves for that and continue to do so while we continue to make progress. We did feel that we need to focus on what we can do, and we had a conversation at the table about older people, and we all felt that there needs to be a consistent effort to solve some of the issues around older people, because that's where a lot of the anxiety is laid. There was some experiences of us as individuals where the majority of areas there was a real mismatch between things like resources and staffing in areas where elderly care patients and quite demanding situations in terms of care were compared to some of those more acute areas. Getting to the second question, do we need a separate college? We had a long conversations about medical colleges versus nursing colleges, and recognise certainly what good engagement looks like and what the RCN are trying to do. And felt that it's a real challenge in terms of there needing to be an independence between the college and the unions. We were a little shocked that some organisations still don't take a level of responsibility in terms of having the right mechanisms in place to demonstrate good standards and outcomes. Let's put it again. We felt that there was some balances of gains versus losses if the RCN changed its function. We spoke a little bit about the pharmacists, and particularly in relation to the fact of the changes they've been through this year, and although recognised that was quite early days. To get to the crux, though, we certainly said that there is room for something to be different, and there's a current gap at the moment, but we just didn't feel that half an hour really justifies coming up with something which is a really big dilemma, actually.
And you highlighted this issue about care for older people is the problem one of the problems that came out of Mid-Staff and warrants some specific attention. Did you highlight any things that you think needed to be done around that particular area other than highlighting it as a problem?
Well, it's a temperature check in a lot of situations. So personally, I just think that if we get it right for those most vulnerable individuals, then it's a really good example of how other things are going on in terms of the organisation. It's about consistency, getting it right every time, all the time for every patient.
Yeah. We've heard some great examples from Good Trust today. It won't necessarily apply to all of the trusts in England. Are things that you'd like to see every trust do to address this area of care for older people? There's some things that you'd like to see come out of the inquiry.
As an older patient, I would really not like to be asked the same question over and over and over again. It can't be beyond the wit of man for somebody to have an in-depth, I believe we used to call them care plans, be able to have an in-depth interview with me at the start of my stay, so I know basic things like and I don't consider myself an older patient, but I have a hearing loss, and I must spend half my time in hospital saying, can you not turn your back on me? I can't hear you. Can you not turn your back on me? I can't hear you. And it goes on and on and on. There must be a way of having a folder or something on there where the questions don't get constantly asked or ignored.
Thank you. Any other things that come to this last question?
I think that nurses in particular need to perhaps certainly in my experience, change the way that they deal with relatives. It seems at the moment that there's a straightforward divide, that either the patient is competent to answer the questions and make the decisions for themselves, or they're not. But that's not as straightforward as that when you're talking about elderly people, because although they have always made their own decisions and still like to think they are making their own decisions, you actually need to involve the families.
That's very good, thank you. Okay, so we've had two practical suggestions. On this last question, I wonder whether our observers had anything to say on this point. Did you come to that particular question, or are there other things that you'd like to share with us? Okay, over here, any key points you'd like to leave us with from your table? Summary.
Hello, my name's Jane Reid. I'm a nurse by profession. I'm speaking to the whole group here on this table. Our note taker's got 3 pages of notes, but her handwriting's too tiny and I can't really see it. So I'm just going to share with you the summary comments, and then Murray's going to offer some sound bites from the things that we captured in the room to illustrate the points that we observed. We didn't address the specific questions. We made observations about the general experience today. In our view, that there seemed to be a polarisation about regulation or not, and the extent to which you need external validation of what's happening in a hospital compared to the internal scrutiny process and assurances. And a big question for us, looking at Kath's presentation and the academic clinical career routes for nurses, was where's the nurse as a non-executive director? So picking up on the question about how would you know about whether the staffing's appropriate or not, how do we use our non-executives to afford a level of scrutiny over clinical care if they don't know what they don't know? So should we be encouraging nurses to move into non-exec positions to add a balance, a clinical balance to the board? We reflected on the makeup of the room here today, and we thought perhaps that it's made up largely of the great and the good, and we wondered whether our discussion might have been a little bit different if we perhaps had an HCA here, a student nurse and a junior staff nurse. And really to get their perspective, particularly on the comments made about whether when we're looking at staffing levels, we factor in the issue and the emotional labour of caring and the importance of building in the notion of emotional resilience. Do we take that into account when we're planning our staffing level? We picked up on the concerns expressed about a disconnect between HEIs and service, and we reflected that this isn't new, it's been there for some time, and again it's one of those variations depending upon where you go in the country, but we reflected on the significant difference between nursing academic clinical careers and medicine. You'd be hard pressed to find a full-time medic in an academic centre or university, but they by far make up the majority of nurse academics, and so we thought the suggestion that Kath was describing was absolutely crucial. We also wondered what's the capacity to triangulate data between universities and service, so thinking about what's the correlation between student experience and patient experience, and was that data shared by the universities providing trainees to in Staffordshire. And then we really thought about the question and challenge from the bottom end of the room from Niall Dixon about the appropriateness of some of our patients and should they be in our hospitals. And we asked ourselves, is our debate today going to address the reforms for the that are going to affect us in the future, and how do we ensure that all of the discussions ensure that nursing is fit for that very different service? And here's
Thank you very much. Murray, a couple of tweets have you got for us, just very briefly?
There were just a couple of comments really. One actually was from the session on regulation, which I think is as pertinent today as it was then, from Andrew Spur, the MD at EDF Nuclear. And he said, "Do not blame the regulators for your own failures. I cannot and will not expect the regulator to do my job for me." And that chimed, I think, with a quote from Jill, who said, "Why is everybody blaming everyone else? We've got to get it sorted ourselves. It's quite simple. Is it good enough for me or a member of my family? And I think, to paraphrase Neil Dixon's comment, which really did stand out today, was that the conversation has been about the NHS as we know it now and in the present, and we're about to, you're on the precipice, if you like, of reforms at the extent of which we have no idea what that's going to look like. And I think his point was that the context within which nursing is taking place at the moment has changed significantly, and the system is designed to deal with the needs of the past.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, and that's a good theme to pass on. Are there comments from the table here that, in addition to what you've heard already?
We've just made 4 very brief comments that may or may not have been made. It's almost embarrassing to say the first one is patient at the centre of what we do. The reality is it's rhetoric into reality. And I think in terms of describing the role of nursing in the value of patient care, what we've got to do is describe hospitals less by the bricks and mortar and more about what they do. We have heard about how big they are, how many beds, and I think we've got to really articulate around the role of nursing within a hospital setting. The other thing, I think, picking up on some of the other points, the bulk of care does occur outside of hospitals, and I think we need to just bear in mind that patients go on pathways of care. The period of time in a hospital is an episode of care, and what we've got to make sure is that joins up with the care that they receive in other places. And in that respect, we've got to emphasise measuring the outcome of the pathway of care, which ultimately is what matters to the patient. We did pick up on the role of commissioners, and I think the gentleman over there mentioned that commissioning will be changing. And maybe this is an opportunity to become more clinically focused in commissioning terms, or making sure that commissioning adds value in terms of interacting with nurses and the outcome of nursing care. The other one, we got into a bit of a philosophical debate, though, around the value of caring and nursing. Maybe we're seeing in society less value placed on caring. Communities that, in days gone by, you would have cared about your neighbours, you'd have known your neighbours, and maybe nowadays we're actually working within a society that has less caring within its value structure.
Okay. I hope that's not too negative to say that it's inevitable that care is not going to be taken into account.